Howard Dean is going to be joining us shortly. Also, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Ron Suskind, as well as Salon.com's Joan Walsh, who'll be here with us in New York. We also have coming up a rundown of all the things that Louisiana Senator David Vitter is famous for. I have to warn you, it's sort of a PG-13 list. But we begin with the revenge of Richard Bruce Cheney. Since leaving office in January, the former vice president, who spent 8 years saying very little publicly. Since he left office, he has been a veritable chatterbox. Over the past 4 months, Mr. Cheney has popped up in a number of different media venues to dispense his message, criticizing the sitting president, defending his role in authorizing torture, and in his latest appearance, offering deeply, deeply unsolicited advice for the struggling Republican Party. For reasons known only to himself, Mr. Cheney this time chose AM 1100 in Fargo, North Dakota, to get his latest message out, specifically addressing a talk show host named Scott Hennon, who bills himself as the chairman of the Common Sense Club. Mr. Chairman asked Mr. Cheney whether there's any reason the Republican Party should moderate itself. And this is asked, of course, in the context of only 20% of Americans currently identifying with the Republican Party, and officials like Mr. Cheney himself being down to an approval rating of roughly that of the black fly in spring. Here was Mr. Cheney's response.
No, I don't. I think it'd be a mistake for us to moderate. This is about fundamental beliefs and values and ideas and what the role of government ought to be in our society and our commitment to the Constitution and constitutional principles. You know, when you add all those things up, the idea that we ought to moderate basically means we ought to fundamentally change our philosophy. And I, for one, am not prepared to do that.
Oh, yes, the man who shredded his own visitor logs waxes eloquent on his commitment to the Constitution. Mr. Cheney then took the opportunity, as he often does, to accuse the current president, President Obama, of endangering the country.
I watch what he's doing, and especially the national security area, which is sort of my first interest. And this whole question of detainees and interrogation of detainees and the terrorist surveillance program and so forth, closing Guantanamo. I don't think the vast majority of Americans support what he wants to do.
For the record, 62% of Americans say they approve of the way President Obama is handling terrorism. That's according to the latest ABC News Washington Post poll. 62%. That would be compared to 47% who said the same thing about President Bush at the end of his term. But overall, I thought Dick Cheney didn't care what people thought, didn't care about the polls. Remember the famous answer to Martha Raddatz when he was defending the war in Iraq?
2/3 of Americans say it's not worth fighting.
So? But Barack Obama better check his polling. Finally, there was a defense of torture offered up by the former vice president, an admission that it was used, but he says it was not used too much.
We were resorted, for example, to waterboarding, which is the source of much of the controversy, with only 3 individuals. And in those cases, it was only after we'd gone through all of the other steps in the process.
We only used it on 3 guys. I mean, sure, one of them got it 183 times in 1 month, but still, we only did it to 3 of them. Now that Dick Cheney is out of office and we get to see him on TV all the time, does it ever seem like he's sort of following a movie plot?
If we're going to talk about Star Wars, we might as well invite Darth Vader.
The reason everybody's laughing is because that's an old joke at this point. Dick Cheney is starting to seem like he's trying to solidify the old cliched Dick Cheney, Darth Vader, Darth Cheney idea.
We were resorted to waterboarding only 3 individuals.
Only you could be so bold.
I think it'd be a mistake for us to moderate. This is about fundamental beliefs and values and ideas. The idea that we ought to moderate basically means we ought to fundamentally change our philosophy.
Had time on our hands. We had an extra intern today. Sorry. The obvious problem here is that the whole embrace the dark side, never give in strategy, it didn't really work out very well politically for the Bush administration. But admitting that is very hard. And so the former vice president is still advising the Republican Party to go with that same strategy, which they may yet do, but which is probably a political death wish. Not to belabor the point. Joining us now is Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Ron Suskind. He's author of the book The 1% Doctrine, which got its title from Vice President Cheney's views on the war on terror. His most recent book is The Way of the World, a story of truth and hope in an age of extremism. Ron Suskind is a much more serious person and journalist than that introduction would suggest, and I thank you, Ron, for coming back on the show.
My pleasure, Rachel.
You have covered the presidency extensively throughout your career. Is there precedent for what Vice President Cheney is doing right now, so recently after leaving office, taking this kind of role?
Really none at all. You know, we have this confused situation where we had co-presidents under the Bush-Cheney era. Now we have one of the presidents retired to this next chapter of his life, Bush, and then the other president, Cheney, in active vituperative attack on a sitting president during the first 100 days. It is without precedent, certainly in our lifetime, for a president to engage this way. You know, most presidents are mindful of the way the electoral process works. There is a new president. He should be respected. Dick Cheney obviously disagrees.
Mr. Cheney has been famously dismissive of opinion polls, famously indifferent to any measure of his own popularity. Given that, provided those things haven't changed, what do you think the strategy is? What do you think is motivating him to speak out so frequently right now?
Well, you know, I think to be fair, you know, Cheney always had his eye on history's ledger. Cheney has, of course, had a long, many-decade term of service in government. Cheney, I think, was always thinking about how history would judge him. In this case, what he's doing is what I call, and a lot of people call, a false framing of the issue of the war on terror. He's essentially setting up a situation to say there's been a change of leadership from the Bush era to the Obama era. Thereby, if there's an attack, and at some point there's going to be an attack, sometime, you know, in our lifetime, clearly, Cheney or whoever represents Cheney at that point can claim causation. It's because of a change of tactics. It's because whoever's sitting in office is not doing the extraordinary and obviously conscience-crushing things that we did. And I think that's a false framing based on the evidence and based on what people who actually fight the so-called war on terror, now a battle against these terror cells, really know and really understand, which is why they're upset to hear Cheney talk this way.
Strategically, though, I understand how he might think this will help him and his legacy. I think that framing point is compelling in terms of trying to cast the Obama administration as a rejection of everything that he and Bush did, and therefore being able to blame them if something goes wrong. But it's also true that him speaking out like this is, I think, really hurting the Republican Party, if only by reminding people that he is a very high-ranking Republican official and the only one you can get an interview with right now. Would he choose his own legacy over his party's legacy and his party's future?
Well, you know, Cheney has always felt it's my way as the only way. And what's fascinating here is that the Republican Party, without, let's just say, a leading voice, is kind of defaulting to the voice of Cheney. Many Republicans that I talk to, and of course many of my sources over years have been Republicans, well, you know, they're just befuddled and livid about Cheney eating up so much airtime. Remember, at one point, President Bush had a 89% approval rating, and in February of 2002, he leaves office, Bush Cheney, at 20%. That's 70 percentage points. Unheard of in terms of that span. And Republicans are saying, please go fishing, an extended fishing trip. Someone do something. And I'm surprised.